There's a deal at the center of American foreign policy that nobody fully understands. And that might be exactly the point. Billions of dollars, nuclear technology, a private equity firm, a kingdom sitting on the world's largest oil reserves. And right now, in the middle of 2026, the entire architecture of that deal is on fire, sometimes literally. What started as a bold, if controversial, strategic realignment between the Trump administration and Saudi Arabia has collided head-on with a regional war that nobody in Washington or Riyadh seems to have truly planned for. And the deeper you look at how this arrangement was structured, the nuclear agreements, the arms deals, the personal financial ties, the more a troubling picture emerges, not just of a foreign policy strategy that failed, but of one that may have been fundamentally compromised from the start.
So let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what's unraveling today, you have to understand what was actually being built. When Donald Trump returned to the presidency, his approach to the Middle East was framed around a simple but sweeping ambition: unite the Sunni Arab world, isolate Iran, and broker a historic normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. It was the kind of grand strategic vision that looks elegant on paper and photographs well at summits. And Saudi Arabia, specifically Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, was the indispensable centerpiece of that vision. Without Riyadh, none of it worked.
The relationship between Trump and MBS was famously personal, famously transactional, and famously resistant to the kind of institutional guardrails that traditionally govern U.S. foreign policy. Arms deals were celebrated like commercial contracts. Diplomatic sensitivities were traded away for investment pledges. And the architecture of the resulting alliance was held together less by formal treaties than by a web of mutual interests, financial arrangements, and what officials would later characterize, somewhat euphemistically, as strategic understandings.
One of the first and most consequential of those understandings involved nuclear technology.
Saudi Arabia has long wanted a civilian nuclear program, and for years the standard U.S. position was that any such cooperation required Riyadh to meet what experts call the gold standard of nonproliferation, a commitment not to enrich uranium domestically, and to grant international inspectors sweeping access to its facilities under the IAEA's additional protocol. The UAE accepted those terms. Saudi Arabia refused.
The Trump administration's response was not to hold firm.
It was to renegotiate the standard itself. According to a report submitted to Congress, U.S. negotiators relaxed the demand for the IAEA additional protocol, instead proposing a, quote, bilateral safeguards agreement that would only apply to specific facilities where direct U.S.-Saudi cooperation occurred. What that means in practice is that the door was opened, not necessarily flung open, but meaningfully cracked, for Saudi Arabia to eventually pursue uranium enrichment technology without the comprehensive oversight that the global nonproliferation regime was designed to provide.
For arms control experts, this was not a minor procedural concession. It was a signal. And the signal was unmistakable. The Trump administration was willing to bend long-standing nonproliferation norms to lock in a geopolitical relationship with Riyadh. The House Oversight Committee heard from whistleblowers who went further still, alleging that Trump officials, including Michael Flynn, attempted to rush the transfer of sensitive nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia in potential violation of existing law. Whether or not those specific allegations were ever fully adjudicated, the broader pattern they described was consistent with everything else happening around it. Meanwhile, the weapons were flowing in quantities that defied easy comprehension.
A $142 billion defense deal, described as the largest of its kind in history, was announced with considerable fanfare, covering missile defense systems, coastal security upgrades, and modernization of the Saudi Air Force.
Then, in May 2025, reports emerged that the administration was preparing another arms package, potentially worth more than $100 billion, that could include the long-coveted F-35 fighter jet. The total value of U.S. weapons committed to or under consideration for Saudi Arabia crossed $250 billion in a matter of months. The weapons industry was, as one outlet put it, cheering. But here's the thing about arms sales as a substitute for actual security. They work until they don't. The logic behind flooding Saudi Arabia with missile defense systems and advanced aircraft was that it would deter aggression and cement the alliance. What happened in 2026 proved that logic was incomplete at best. To understand how the region arrived at full-scale war, you have to trace a line back through 2 years of escalating pressure and failed diplomacy. In June 2025, what would later be called the 12-day war unfolded with terrifying speed. Israel launched a wave of airstrikes targeting Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure. The United States went further, striking the heavily fortified underground enrichment facilities at Fordow and Natanz with bunker-busting munitions. Iran retaliated, hitting U.S. military bases in Qatar, targeting Israeli population centers with ballistic missiles, and demonstrating that its capacity to strike across the region had not been fundamentally degraded. A fragile ceasefire was eventually brokered. Iran's nuclear program had been damaged, but it had not been destroyed. And in a move that carried enormous symbolic weight, Tehran suspended cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency entirely, effectively slamming the door on international inspectors and operating in the nuclear dark. The maximum pressure strategy, which was supposed to force Iran to the table and compel meaningful concessions, had instead produced a more defiant, more opaque, and more dangerous Iran. The second phase began on February 28, 2026. Following the collapse of nuclear negotiations in Geneva, where mediators had reportedly come tantalizingly close to an agreement only to see it dissolve, the United States and Israel launched what would become known as Operation Epic Fury. The scale was staggering. Approximately 900 strikes in 12 hours, targeting military command structures, missile stockpiles, and critically, the Iranian leadership itself. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. Dozens of senior officials perished alongside him. What the planners in Washington and Tel Aviv almost certainly hoped would be a decisive blow, instead triggered precisely the scenario that every serious analyst had warned about. Iran's response was not a targeted counterattack. It was a regional eruption. Hundreds of ballistic missiles and thousands of drones were launched across multiple theaters simultaneously. U.S. embassies in the region were hit. Military installations across the Gulf were targeted. And Saudi Arabia, which had spent billions on U.S.-supplied missile defense systems and had been assured by its American partners that those investments would protect it, watched Iranian ordnance strike its own territory, including critical oil infrastructure. For the Saudis, it was a nightmare they had long feared and publicly hoped would never materialize. Iran also targeted vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, threatening to choke off roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply. In a matter of hours, the Middle East had shifted from a region under pressure to a region at war. And this is where the cracks in the secret deal architecture became impossible to ignore. The defense pact that Saudi Arabia had sought from Washington, the formal binding security guarantee that Riyadh had been angling for throughout the negotiation process, was never actually finalized as a treaty. Instead, what the two sides were discussing was an executive order modeled on a similar arrangement recently struck with Qatar. Under this framework, an attack on Saudi Arabia would be formally treated as a threat to U.S. national security. It sounded significant. But unlike a NATO-style mutual defense treaty ratified by Congress, an executive order can be reversed by the next administration. It has no permanent legal force.
And as the Iranian strikes demonstrated, it does not guarantee that America can or will intercept every missile heading for Saudi soil. The Saudis had seen this movie before. Back in September 2019, Iranian-linked drone and missile attacks struck the Opaque and Kurez oil facilities, temporarily knocking out roughly half of Saudi Arabia's oil production capacity in a single strike. The Trump administration at the time offered condemnations and sold more weapons. It did not respond militarily. Riyadh drew its own conclusions from that episode, and those conclusions have only hardened since February 2026. The Saudi leadership is not naive. They understand that the American security umbrella is real, but conditional. Conditioned on U.S. domestic politics, on the depth of the president's personal commitment, on whether Congress is willing to back it up, and on whether the geography and stakes of any given crisis align with American strategic interests in the moment. What MBS has been engineering, quietly but deliberately, is a hedge against the unreliability of that umbrella. The most striking element of that hedge is the defense pact signed with Pakistan in late 2025. Pakistan is a nuclear-armed state. And in a statement that reverberated across every foreign ministry in the region, Pakistan's defense minister made explicit what had previously only been implied. Pakistan's nuclear program, he said, would be made available to Saudi Arabia if needed. Let that sink in. Saudi Arabia, which has repeatedly been told by Washington that it cannot be allowed to develop nuclear weapons, has now secured at least a rhetorical nuclear guarantee from a country that actually has them. And it did so without asking Washington's permission. This is not a small development. This is Riyadh telling the world, and telling the United States, that it has alternatives, that its security calculus does not begin and end with American arms sales and executive orders, that if pushed to the wall, it has options. And it is a move that almost certainly would not have happened, or at least not so openly, if the Trump administration's diplomatic architecture had been functioning as intended. Layered on top of all of this is the question that keeps the normalization dream firmly in the past tense: the Palestinian issue. The Trump administration's signature regional ambition was to expand the Abraham Accords, the agreements that brought the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco into formal diplomatic relations with Israel, and crown that effort with the ultimate prize, Saudi-Israeli normalization. On paper, the logic was compelling. A formal Saudi-Israeli relationship would represent a seismic shift in regional dynamics, effectively formalizing a strategic alliance against Iran and offering Israel legitimacy in the broader Arab world that it had never before possessed. Saudi Arabia's conditions were equally clear, and they had not changed. Riyadh would not normalize relations with Israel without a credible, time-bound roadmap to Palestinian statehood. This was not a vague expression of solidarity. It was a hard red line, rooted in domestic Saudi politics, Islamic legitimacy, and regional optics that MBS, for all his reforms and pragmatism, could not simply discard. The Crown Prince is a modernizer, but he still governs a kingdom whose legitimacy rests in part on its custodianship of the Islamic holy sites. Being seen to abandon the Palestinians for a transactional deal with Israel would carry costs that even a $142 billion arms package cannot offset. Benjamin Netanyahu's government has been equally unambiguous in the opposite direction. Palestinian statehood is not something the current Israeli coalition will accept. Full stop. The two positions are not separated by a negotiating gap that skilled diplomacy could bridge. They are separated by a fundamental contradiction. And by early 2026, Saudi officials were no longer even pretending to engage on the normalization question when meeting with American counterparts. Bilateral conversations shifted to defense and investment. Normalization was, for all practical purposes, off the table. If you want to understand how this situation feels inside the relationship, consider one figure who sits at the very intersection of American diplomacy, Saudi money, and political controversy. Jared Kushner. 6 months after leaving the White House, where he had served as a senior advisor handling Middle East policy, among other portfolios, Kushner launched a private equity firm called Affinity Partners. Shortly thereafter, the firm secured a $2 billion investment from Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, the sovereign wealth fund controlled directly by MBS. The internal process behind that investment is, to put it mildly, revealing. Saudi PIF's own screening committee reviewed the proposal and came back with sharp concerns. According to internal documents that later became public, the committee cited the inexperience of Affinity Partners management, described its operations as unsatisfactory in all aspects, and flagged serious public relations risks. In other words, the people whose job it was to evaluate whether this was a sound investment concluded that it wasn't. And then MBS personally overruled them. Days after the screening committee submitted its objections, the PIF board, chaired by the Crown Prince, approved the $2 billion commitment. The deal generates approximately $25 million per year in asset management fees for Kushner's firm. The House Oversight Committee launched a formal investigation. Ethics experts were blunt in their assessments. Kushner, they argued, had spent his White House years defending Saudi Arabia in the aftermath of the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, facilitating the very arms sales now being scrutinized, and shaping a Middle East policy that consistently prioritized Saudi interests. The question the investigation sought to answer was not subtle. Did Jared Kushner use his government position to benefit the kingdom? And was the $2 billion a deferred reward for those services? Kushner has defended the investment, and no criminal charges have been filed. But the perception problem does not require a criminal finding to matter. When the architect of an administration's Middle East policy subsequently becomes the recipient of a $2 billion investment from the primary beneficiary of that policy, the appearance of conflict of interest is, at minimum, corrosive to the credibility of the entire framework. It feeds the narrative, accurate or not, that what was being sold to the American public as a grand strategic realignment was, at least in part, a transaction with personal financial dimensions that the public was never told about. If you've been following this story, if you've found any of this useful, take a second and subscribe. This channel is going to keep tracking how this conflict develops and what it means for global energy markets, nuclear proliferation, and American power in the region. There's a lot more to cover, and the people in charge would prefer you not pay attention. So where does all of this leave us as of March 2026? The deal, to the extent it was ever a coherent deal, is buckling. The $142 billion in arms didn't keep Iranian missiles off Saudi soil. The nuclear cooperation agreement loosened standards that experts spent decades building without actually delivering the relationship stability that was supposed to justify the compromise. The normalization dream between Saudi Arabia and Israel has collided with the hard reality of Palestinian politics and the Israeli government's refusal to engage. And Saudi Arabia, rather than locking itself more tightly into the American orbit, is actively building off-ramps, cultivating Pakistan as a nuclear partner, deepening economic ties with China, and making clear to Washington that exclusivity in this relationship is no longer on offer. The Iran war has not resolved anything. Killing Khamenei did not end the Islamic Republic, any more than decapitating a government has ever reliably ended the state it governed. Iran's retaliatory strikes demonstrated that even a severely damaged military apparatus can impose massive costs on the entire region. The Strait of Hormuz remains a choke point around which the global economy still nervously breathes. And the nuclear question, the question that supposedly justified all of this, is now more urgent and less answerable than it was before the first American bunker buster fell on Fordow. What seems increasingly clear is that the
personalized, opaque, transactional style of diplomacy that defined the Trump-Saudi alignment was always more fragile than its architects acknowledged. When the deal rests on personal relationships rather than institutional frameworks, it moves with the relationships. When it prioritizes commercial outcomes over strategic coherence, the commercial outcomes remain while the strategy dissolves. And when it creates the appearance, even if unproven, that personal financial interests shaped foreign policy decisions, it generates a cloud of legitimacy questions that never fully disperses. The future of US-Saudi relations will be shaped by what comes after the Iran conflict, by who controls Congress and the White House, and by the choices MBS makes as he navigates a more dangerous and more multipolar world than the one he inherited. But one thing is already evident. The era of exclusive, personalized, handshake-style strategic pacts is over. What replaces it will be more conditional, more openly transactional, and far less likely to be described in any official document as a deal at all. That, perhaps, is the most honest outcome of the whole arrangement. In trying to build something secret and sweeping, the Trump administration and its Saudi partners may have succeeded mainly in demonstrating why secret and sweeping rarely survives contact with the actual world.